Right, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I thought I'd do a little bit of an explanation just about what is this whole thing with valve clearances and valve gaps. I thought it might be a bit useful to go over things.
At the top end of the engine is where it takes in petrol and air and spits out the exhaust gases. It does this through valves. Now, you can't see the valves, but here's a picture of some valves which I took apart earlier. They're pocket type valves, so when you press down on them, they open. They're pressed down, they're opened by the camshafts. These are the two camshafts here. You can see the knobbles on them, the lobes, which are what, when the camshaft's rotating, that's what presses down on the valves to open them. If the camshaft was still slightly pressing down on them, they wouldn't shut properly. So there has to be a slight gap between the camshaft and the valve. This gap is vitally important, okay? This is the gap which decides on exactly when the valve's going to open and how much the valve is going to open for. And the camshaft is kept tight by the cam chain tensioner, which, as you can see, fits in this hole here. Now this was a bit of a pain, because although one bolt is fairly easily accessible, you can see that the inner bolt, I'll try and move this around here a little bit, you can see that the inner bolt is really quite hidden by the exhaust. So trying to get a tool in there required me to go ransacking all sorts of little tools I haven't used for ages. Eventually found a super short 8mm socket using my flattest ratchet. I was able to get that out. Turns out that the cam chain tensioner is manual and doesn't have a gasket. Now, the fact it doesn't have a gasket is just a bit of a pain, just means it needs to go back together with a bit of instant gasket. But the fact it's manual makes me wonder. These engines are notorious for bad starting because of, well, people say it's valve clearances. But I wonder whether it may also be because of badly adjusted cam chain tension. You can imagine that the cam chain tension isn't quite right, then the valves aren't going to be opening and closing at exactly the right time, giving a very similar symptom to badly adjusted valve clearances. Well, maybe it's a combination of the two. Right, this is the top of one of the valves. You can see I've moved the camshaft out of the way and exposed the what's called the bucket and the shim. If I use this useful suction tool, I should be able to stick onto that and pull the bucket out. There's the top of the valve. So here is bucket and shim. This is a shim over bucket, rather obviously, because the shim sits on top of the bucket. In some cases, you can get the shim out without taking the camshaft out, without taking the bucket and shim out of the engine. You get a little tool which will come in like that, press down on the bucket away from the camshaft, which then allows you to extract the shim. But there's not an awful lot of room to land a tool on this, so it's just as easy to take the camshaft out and take the bucket and shims out of the engine. So, having measured the gaps and having measured all of the shims, I've worked out what the gaps should be, or rather I've worked out what the shims should be because I know what the gaps should be from the service information for the engine. You put all of that into a little calculation, tells you what the correct shims should be. You then have a look through what shims you've got, decide what shims you've got go where and what shims you need. Now, unfortunately, it turns out that these shims are only available from Rotax. They're 29mm diameter. So yeah, once they come in, assembly, as they say, should be the reverse of disassembly.
So that's a brief description of why valve clearances are so important and where I'm at with this. I'm hoping that the new shims are going to be arriving in the next couple of days and I'll be able to get this back together. In the meantime, I've still got my bag of lovely shiny carburetor bits. Late update. Look what's arrived.